Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our monthly presentation that the Circle of Life does the first Thursday of every month, related to all things quality of life, end of life, information that you didn't know you needed, and information that you've been looking for. So we hope we can help you today. For the Circle of Life Coalition, we envision an informed community open to honest conversations about life and death, one in which we inspire each other to live life fully while acknowledging the inevitability of death, and where choices for end-of-life care are effectively communicated, documented, respected, and honored. We like to live that mission. This is a safe space to ask any questions. Little housekeeping. You can put any questions or comments in the chat box. Our speakers today have indicated they would like those questions at the end, so we will save them to do that. This will be recorded as Facebook Live, and it is recorded and edited and will be on our YouTube channel within a week or two. If you would like to forward this to anybody, it's good information no matter what state you're in. You have to abide by your own state laws, etc., but it's great information to go by to get started. Also, we will be at Boscov's on October 18th for our friends and family. If you purchase a coupon from us for $5, then you get big discounts throughout the store throughout the entire day. We will be there from like 10 to 12, and we can give them to you or sell them to you for that $5 in advance if you wish. So today, I'm very excited to present or talk about our speakers just a little bit. They are board members of the Circle of Life Coalition. They bring such a wealth of knowledge and expertise about which they're speaking today, and utilize that every single day in their practice, and just want to make sure that our community of listeners and watchers gets to benefit from their knowledge. Our first speaker is Maureen Gorman. She is a lawyer with Stevens and Lee. She does trust and estates groups. It prepares estate planning documents and helps executors and trustees with estate and trust administration matters. Our second person is Kim Ressler. She is our treasurer. She works for Univest Bank, is a certified guardian, and also helps folks with their financial planning, any questions that they might have. I'm sure she can elaborate further on that more than I can. Also then, our third person is Samantha Smith. She is with Kuhn Funeral Home and just knows everything there is to know about planning for a funeral and other things also that you might not even think of, and can answer all kinds of questions. So those are our speakers for today. Again, if you have any questions, put them in the chat box. We will be turning off your cameras and muting you so that we don't have any interference with our recording. Without further ado, Kim, Samantha, and Maureen, what I wish I knew, unexpected death.
Thank you, Deb. I'm actually going to be taking over just prior to Maureen and Kim. Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha. I'm a licensed funeral director, and I've been living and working in Berks County since 2018. In addition to holding my funeral director's license, I am also a licensed insurance agent with a limited writing line for the purposes of assisting families in pre-planning funeral services. I am really excited to be able to speak with everyone today. When the idea of this conversation was first presented, I ended up getting a phone call around the same time that Kim, Maureen, and I were starting to plan this talk. The woman who I spoke with, I'm going to call her Sue. Her mother was very elderly. She doesn't have any immediate health concerns, but Sue still was very concerned about what should she do in the event of her mother's death. What steps would she need to take? As a funeral director, I frequently work with families who their loss is completely unexpected. There has been no planning. There's no idea of what to do, where to turn, where to start. So I really appreciated being able to have this conversation with Sue. So in answering her question, I hope that Kim, Maureen, and I are able to address the concerns for anyone who's joining us here today. So please bear with me as I remember how to share my screen. Okay. Okay. Can everyone see the slideshow? Excellent. I'm getting nods. Yes. So Kim, Maureen, and I are going to be talking about what to do when death is unexpected. What immediately happens following death is greatly dependent on the circumstances of that death. Most deaths can be understood as occurring under one of three following scenarios. The first are deaths which occur in a facility such as a hospital or a nursing home. When a death occurs in an institution, the facility staff is going to handle some steps for a family. If necessary, a death is going to be reported to a county coroner or medical examiner's office. Nursing homes are generally required to report all deaths to the local jurisdiction, but hospitals will generally only report deaths which are required to be reported, such as deaths which occur in an emergency room or an operating room. Hospital procedures regarding discharge of deceased patients generally require that families be asked if they've selected a funeral home. This question is asked for documentation purposes. The hospital needs to know who they have permission to release remains to. But typically, hospital staff is not going to notify a funeral home that the patient has died. This fact is not always made clear to the family. Nursing home staff, on the other hand, will generally notify a funeral home for a family. A good rule of thumb to remember is that if a loved one has passed away unexpectedly as an inpatient at a hospital, never assume that the funeral home is aware of the patient's death. I cannot tell you the number of times I've received panic phone calls mid-afternoon on Monday or even Tuesday from families who were expecting our team to reach out to them. It is a terrible shock to find out that the first time a funeral home knows that someone passes away is when the family calls us days later. The second general scenario I'd like to talk about is when a loved one passes away under the care of a hospice organization. If someone is on hospice care, I wouldn't necessarily say that their death is unexpected, but that doesn't mean that a family has had time to take the steps to plan. Upon the death of a loved one, the first phone call a family needs to make should be to that hospice organization so that a nurse can be dispatched to the residence in order to formally pronounce the patient as deceased. That hospice nurse will generally call a chosen funeral home on the family's behalf. The last scenario I'd like to address is when a death occurs unattended. What does the term unattended mean? This term categorizes deaths which occur outside of medical supervision, deaths which are sudden or traumatic, deaths which occur when someone lacks a primary care physician who's recently treated the individual, and deaths which may result from crime, suspected chemical intoxications, or other items that may fall under the purview of the coroner's office. There is no greater shock than the discovery of someone who's passed away, regardless as to whether the cause is natural, accidental, or otherwise. No matter how obviously deceased a person may be, the first phone call a family must always make is to 911. EMS may be dispatched, police may be dispatched, and ultimately a coroner's office may be dispatched. But there are procedures that must be followed before a funeral home is permitted to transfer the remains of a loved one into our care. The death must be pronounced. A determination must be made as to whether further investigation will be required. If the coroner, coroner's deputy, or medical examiner believes that the death was due to natural causes, the remains of the loved one will likely be released directly to a family's chosen funeral home. However, if accidental or criminal causes are suspected, or it's not immediate evident what is the cause of someone's passing, the coroner's office may take custody of the remains and transfer those remains to their holding center pending either an autopsy, further testing, or there may be a period of time that the body is held before those decisions are made. Our local coroner's office holds the remains of deceased at Reading Hospital. When the coroner is able to release remains, a family's chosen funeral home will transfer the body of the deceased from the coroner's facility to their funeral home. All of the scenarios I've outlined ultimately end with the funeral home taking possession of human remains and transferring those remains to the funeral home. If the family does not have a funeral home chosen, well, most hospice agencies, hospitals, and coroner's deputies are going to have available a list of local funeral homes. A hospice nurse may even be willing to help a family make calls to funeral homes to get additional information or quotes. In the immediate aftermath of a death, a family does not always have a great deal of time to make this key decision. Typically, a coroner or hospice nurse cannot leave a residence without confirmation regarding what funeral home will be taking custody of remains on a family's behalf. So how do you choose from a list of names what funeral home is going to best serve your family? I can tell you no one expects to be in the position of having to make this choice. So what criteria do you use? Under ideal circumstances, most families would likely say they would choose a funeral home based on cost, locations, amenities available for a family's comfort, or options to make a funeral more personalized. But when it's 2 a.m. and someone you love is lying dead on the floor, thinking clearly and obtaining the information you want to be able to choose the right funeral home is easier said than done, depending on what funeral home you are calling. If you're calling outside of the funeral home's normal manned hours, an answering service or a transfer service may be taking calls on that funeral home's behalf, making it difficult sometimes to get detailed answers to your questions. Often a family relies on the reputation of a business. Families may ask friends or other relatives for recommendations. A family may simply call a firm that they know handled another family member's death. And if that firm treated the family well before and handled a previous funeral with dignity, respect, and compassion, there's nothing wrong with this. But maybe the family didn't have such a good experience that first time. During the initial phone call with a funeral home, the funeral home will collect the key information they need. Who has died? Where is their body? Who is the key point of contact with the family? After finishing this initial conversation, the funeral home is going to make internal arrangements to have their staff travel to the location to take physical custody of the loved one's remains. As important as it is to simply choose a funeral home, choosing a funeral home is just one of the potentially 150 or more choices a family must make within the first critical 24 to 48 hours after their loved one's passing. Often during the initial phone call, an appointment will be set up for the family to meet with the funeral director to plan the loved one's services and go through the options. Additionally, the family may be asked during that first phone call if any decision has been made as to whether or not there will be traditional viewing for their loved one. The funeral home asks this question because they are trying to determine if embalming is going to be necessary. Embalming is a chemical procedure in which temporarily preserves, sanitizes, and restores the physical appearance of the remains. It's important to know that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania does not require embalming per se. But if the family is choosing to have a traditional funeral, individual funeral homes may require embalming. Generally, the sooner a funeral home can perform this procedure, the better the final results are. So a funeral home will ask for permission to perform the embalming very early in their interactions with the family. The arrangement conference, the appointment where the family is actually meeting with funeral home staff to plan the service, is where the other 149 or more choices are discussed, as well as other necessary information gathered. If the family hasn't already made a decision regarding whether their loved one will have a burial or whether their loved one should have a cremation, well, the family is going to need to make this choice fairly quickly, as many other decisions are dependent on this. What casket should be used? If the cemetery requires an out-of-burial container, which one is the most appropriate? If the loved one is being cremated, what style of urn is most fitting? Is there going to be a funeral service? If so, where? Will it be a traditional service at the loved one's church? Would it be a service at graveside? Or will it be a more casual celebration of life? Should there be a viewing at the funeral home, or is there another venue that's more appropriate? If the family is having a viewing, what kind of clothing should the loved one wear? And even if there's not going to be formal viewing, would there be a particular outfit the family wants their loved one dressed in anyway? Will there be flowers ordered to decorate the casket, the urn, or the room? Is there special music that should be played? Are there special readings the family would like to share? Will there be an open forum for the sharing of memories? Is there going to be a formal eulogy? Will there be a meal following the service? Is that meal open for all guests or limited to the few family members? What will the menu be? Will it be an open bar? Will there be a toast? What date and time makes sense for these events? What days can a church accommodate? Is the cemetery also available? Is a restaurant available? Is a given minister available? Will there be military honors as part of the service, or will there be any other fraternal orders such as the Freemasons or the Odd Fellows participating? How and where should the information about the service be shared? Will an obituary be published? Is it going to be in the newspaper, or is it just going to be shared through a funeral home's website? All of these decisions can be dizzying if someone's loved one has never offered any guidance as to what his or her wishes would be. Talk to your loved ones while they are alive, while you are able to have a conversation and have input, because there is no worse feeling than being asked some of these questions and just not knowing. Another major challenge for most families after the unexpected death of a loved one is financial. How will a funeral and everything that comes with that funeral be paid for? Most families have no idea what to expect in terms of cost for a funeral, especially if there hasn't been another funeral recently within the family. I'm going to share an infographic with you that might be quite shocking. Before I share this graphic, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Federal Trade Commission's funeral rule. This rule is national legislation that went into effect in 1984 and governs how all funeral homes in the United States must operate. Funeral homes are required to disclose their pricing through use of a general price list, which must be given in print to any person who is meeting with a funeral home. That list must be itemized and contain every regularly offered service. Using this general price list, a statement of goods and services will be completed specific to the services and merchandise that a family chooses to utilize. With the exception of basic services, the funeral home and staff, all items are optional. Meaning that if things have to be included for the type of services a family is choosing, it must be disclosed to them. A funeral home is not permitted just to add something just because. When calling a funeral home to inquire as to costs, the funeral rule also requires staffs of the funeral home to answer any and all questions about their charges. Now that we've cleared this hurdle, I'm going to share with you the infographic that has a pretty good breakdown about what to expect different types of funerals cost. The infographic I'm sharing is put together by Stardust Memorials, a company that provides urns and other keepsake goods for funerals. This graphic was put together based on information published in reports by the National Funeral Directors Association and the Federal Trade Commission based on national data. Typically, average costs for a burial with funeral services will range from anywhere starting around $7,000 to $10,000 or more. A typical traditional burial includes the professional services of the funeral home, transfer of the deceased into the funeral home's care, embalming if permission to embalm has been given, the dressing and reposing of the body in a chosen casket, regardless of if it is metal, wood, or some other material, use of facilities and staff for viewing, use of facilities and staff for formal services, the use of a hearse, a service car, printed stationery if the family selects it. On the other hand, cremation charges are usually less. They can range anywhere from around $5,600 to $8,600, typically entailing the professional charges of the funeral home, transport the deceased person into the funeral home's care, any costs associated with the cremation, such as a coroner's permit, a container to hold the body prior to cremation, cremation fees if that crematory utilizes a third-party crematory. It's really important to find out if your funeral home runs their own crematory or if they utilize a third party. Not every funeral home is going to neatly line up with these estimates. Many funeral homes will have higher charges while other funeral homes have lower. Not every funeral home offers the same options. The funeral rule also requires funeral homes to list pricing for direct disposition options where no funeral services will be held. The remains are buried or cremated very swiftly following death without ceremony. Opting for a direct burial or a direct cremation can seem like a financially attractive option, but please keep in mind that direct disposition options may be very limited as to what is included in a funeral home services. As a funeral director, I field many initial calls from families seeking information as to the cost of a direct cremation, and I answer their questions, but I also like to ask a few of my own in return. Because I often find that while many families may not want to hold formal public ceremonies, they do want to have a private viewing for close friends and family to have the option to say goodbye to their loved one, especially if the passing is unexpected. Most funeral homes are going to be able to host private viewings where a loved one may have been kept in climate control rather than being embalmed, dressed in their own clothing, and reposed on something like a slumber bed rather than laid out in a casket. But for many funeral homes, that is not considered a direct cremation. My theory is that most people don't really know what questions to ask. So price seems like a safe place to start. And it's often the way that many consumers try to compare what services they will get from funeral home to funeral home. But it's not as simple as that. It's not an apple-to-apple comparison. When getting quotes for services, families should ask what items are specifically included in a given price. Ask for the breakdown. If the funeral home's not willing to give that to you, it's time to call another funeral home. I'd like to pull your attention to a few items that are not listed on the graphic. These items are referred to as cash advances. A cash advance is defined by the funeral rule as any item of service or merchandise described to a purchaser as a cash advance, accommodation, cash disbursement, or a similar term. Essentially, a cash advance item is any item that a funeral home is obtaining from a third party. The funeral home is paying for that item on the purchaser's behalf. These items may include, but are not limited to, cemetery or crematory services, pallbearers, public transportation, honoraria for clergy, flowers, musicians, singers, obituary notices, gratuities, and death certificates. Funeral homes are required by the funeral rule to disclose to the consumer if they are being charged an additional fee for the funeral home services in procuring or arranging for any cash advance item beyond the actual cost paid by the funeral home. Cash advances are items that are in addition to the services and merchandise for which a funeral home is directly responsible. For example, most funeral homes do not own publishing companies and therefore must work with a third party in order to publish an obituary for a family. The newspaper does not publish the obituary for free. The funeral home must pay the newspaper, often prior to publication, in order to have the obituary run. While most funeral homes are willing to advance the fee to the newspaper on a family's behalf, that funeral home is going to expect their outlaying of cash to be reimbursed in addition to the charges for their directly provided services and merchandise. A major item that funeral directors are responsible for procuring on a family's behalf is certified copies of a loved one's death certificate. The death certificate is a legal document with 3 major parties contributing to the contents.
Thank you.
From the information gathered from the family during the arrangement conference, the funeral home will input all personal data about the deceased onto the certificate. Once all components are complete, pronouncing, certification, and the personal data, a funeral home is responsible for submission of the completed document to the Department of Health's Division of Vital Records for ratification. Once ratified, certified copies can be ordered from either a local registrar or state registrar. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania charges $20 for each certified copy of the death certificate. There is a veterans waiver program that the Commonwealth offers, allowing death certificates to be ordered for veterans at no cost. However, the Division of Vital Records is in the midst of a policy change that will limit on whose behalf a funeral home is able to order death certificates through the veterans waiver. So this may not be an option for all families. Certified death certificates are going to be necessary for almost every aspect of managing someone's affairs. And while a funeral home will procure death certificates for a family, beyond procuring the death certificates, the family is going to be responsible for most of the next steps, which is where is the most appropriate place to turn this conversation over to Kim and Maureen.
Thank you, Samantha. My name is Kim Ressler, and I am a vice president with Univest Bank and Trust Company. And as Univest will serve as a corporate executor, so I have some experience on handling estates. So we'll take it from there. So at this point, the funeral services, have occurred. So let's talk a little bit about handling the actual estate. Hopefully, when someone makes a decision to appoint an executor, an executrix, which by the way is a female, they have discussed this with the appointee. I'm sorry, Samantha, I am not giving you the forward. The appointee actually, believe it or not, doesn't always view this role as a gift, and sometimes may lack the capacity to take care of what needs to be taken care of. Capacity could be mental capacity, time, it's very labor intensive and takes a lot of time in the beginning. Or perhaps they live across the country. While it's not impossible to settle an estate from a distance, it definitely makes things a little bit more complex. So if you actually are appointed executor, you actually do not need to accept the appointment. And in fact, you can renounce. We can talk a little bit about that. Some people elect not to serve as an executor because, quite honestly, it opens up the potential for some family issues, fighting, bickering. Everyone believes that their family is different and they won't fight over things. But, I've experienced people, fighting over the smallest things, the quilt, the coffee table. So there are times when, the appointee just doesn't want to get involved in that. Next. So probating is actually the process of you going to the Register of Wills to legally be appointed the executor. There are a few things you need to take with you and be sure to have. One is the original will and codicil, which a codicil is actually updates or amendments to the original will. You will need an original death certificate. There is documentation that needs to be completed for the probate, which you can find on the Register of Wills site. You'll need photo ID. If there are renunciations, those things are notarized, and you will need a method to pay for the probate fees. Probate fees, besides the fees that the Register of Wills will charge for filing and things like that, the probate fee is actually based on the value of the estate also. At this point in time, you don't know the value, so you're going to estimate, and the probate fee on that is 2% of the value of the estate. You can probate in person, or since COVID, you can now probate virtually, which is WebEx, Zoom. Certainly more convenient. Like I said, COVID really started up the virtual method. Next. So the letters testamentary and the short certificates is the documentation that you need to start taking care of things. You may think you have power to do things before that. Maybe you were appointed the power of attorney, but the power of attorney dies along with the person. So until you have these two documents in hand, there's not really anything that you are able to take care of. Next. So we'll talk a little bit about the duties of an estate. And one of the largest things that you'll have to deal with is the real estate. So if there is real estate within the estate, and not all houses in the states look like this one, but there are additional responsibilities and things that you need to take care of. In fact, for most of us, real estate is the most valuable asset that we may own. Next. So with real estate, if you remember that the primary job of an executor is to gather, marshal, and secure all assets, and this would be inclusive of the real estate. Will you be selling this home, or will you be distributing it in kind to one of the beneficiaries? You do need to ensure that your homeowners is in place. If God forbid a fire burns down the home, you are legally responsible for that as executor, and you could run into some potential legal issues there. The other thing is you need to restrict access. There are people who can have keys. Family members can have keys. Service providers, perhaps the cleaning lady has a key or the neighbor has a key. So if you do not know who has the keys, the best thing to do is change the locks. Believe it or not, and you can believe it, I'm sure, is there are a lot of unsavory individuals out there who actually search through the obituaries and then find out if they own real estate. And the obituary also includes the date and time of the funeral. So they are betting that that house is going to be empty during that funeral. So it's a great opportunity for them to go in there and take what they may like. So if possible, you want to make it appear as if somebody is in the home, leave the lights on, put a car in the driveway, because I have personally run into this once where somebody during the service, went and stole some things out of the home. Next. So unless you visit this person on a regular basis, you really have no idea what you're walking into when you go into this real estate. Many times the elderly become isolated, so nobody knows what's going on inside or behind that door. You're going to find hoarders. You're going to find people who just stop cleaning, whether they could not complete it any longer physically or they just don't care. You will find dirt, you will find mold, you will find grime, you will find rotting food. So you never know what's going on behind that closed door. Next. So I'm going to share a couple pictures of a home that was part of an estate where Univest serves as executor. And this is within the past year. So this is a picture of this gentleman's kitchen. So this man was isolated. He never had anybody over to his home. He was also extremely thrifty, which helped him in accumulating a $1.5 million estate. So if you look up in the corner, there's that little old radio. That actually is the only form of entertainment this man had. There was no TV. There was no internet. He did not have a cell phone. So just points out how simply people can live. Next. So just another view of the kitchen, just to give you an idea of, what the table looked like, what the floor looked like. Next. Now, this is his fridge, and yes, that is dirt and grime on the outside of it. I did not open it up, but I could only imagine what surprises were in there. Next. Just the final view of the kitchen. If you'll take notice of the stove and the sink, I bet those were from 1920 when this home was built. So this man did nothing to update. The sink's kind of cool though, but the stove, that would have to go. Next. A picture of one of the bedrooms in the home. This just points out, I believe, how you really do need to go through everything. And many times things aren't organized or where you think they should be. I had a home for a couple who did not pass away, but were moved to a facility due to unsafe conditions in their home. There were huge hoarders, much worse than this. There was a very small pathway to walk within these rooms. And what we discovered is that they like to hide cash in their house. Again, it didn't make sense, no rhyme or reason where they hid it, in paper McDonald's bags. So we ended up finding thousands of dollars underneath all of this stuff. Next. So again, just another view of another bedroom. While this, looks pretty bad, in my experience, I've seen much, much worse than this. Next. So if we remember, this gentleman who passed had a $1.5 million estate. This is a picture, one picture of his bedroom. You can see how he, what he slept on. That's a twin bed. It's smack up against probably a wall that's mold. Again, a very rich individual, but did not live as if he was. Next. Still in the bedroom here, just trying to give you an idea of how small this room was. And then if we go to the next one, that's the opposite wall of the bedroom. It was really, to me, it felt like a jail cell that this man was sleeping in. It, there was nothing modern, nothing taken care of. Next. This is a picture of his dining room. Probably years and years ago, there was a small leak in the roof. He did not address it, so now we had all kinds of mold happening. So things just kept deteriorating there. Next. So another duty that you have, you're marshaling and securing the real estate, is to take care of the valuables that are within the house. So it could be jewelry, it could be antiques, it could be guns. Whatever it is, you need to locate these items and you need to ensure that they are kept safe and they're secure. I recommend that you remove these items of value from the home because, again, we remember those unsavory characters who like to help themselves. Next. I'm going to go over just some of the duties. This is not all-inclusive by any means. Online access. In today's world, people are doing all kinds of things online. So if possible, and you're appointed, asking the person for their IDs and passwords will really help you out. You want to very quickly change the address with the post office. You do not want mail piling up in front of the door. Again, a red flag, or I should say a green flag for thieves. You also need to be on top of everything that's coming in. So you will need to, even though you change the address, you do need to hit the mailbox on a pretty frequent basis. You're going to contact utilities. Which should I keep on? What should I turn off? You want to keep the heat on. It could be in the winter. You don't want the pipes to freeze. You want to keep the electric on because you're going to be in there cleaning out that house. Turn off the phone, turn off the cable, those type of things. You're going to stop any type of auto payments that are occurring, pay the decedent's debts. And what I find is companies, once they understand the situation, are pretty understandable and do not send it on to collections. So I would recommend calling them and just letting them know that this person passed away and that you will be making payment when you are able. Next. There's life insurance policies that need to be made claims on. You're going to request refunds. You're going to need an estate checking account because this is what you're going to use to pay bills and also deposit checks. Date of death balances on all of the accounts will be needed because these figures are required for inheritance taxes. You're going to arrange liquidations, whether you're selling the personal property, the gold, the house, or there's an investment account. Final income taxes for the person are going to need to be filed, even if the person lived 5 days into the year. There is a final that needs to be filed so that the IRS and the state know that this person has passed away. Apply for an EIN number. So just as you and I have our Social Security numbers, an estate actually has its own little special number also. So that is something that you have to get. You will have to locate the beneficiaries and get some information from them. If you can't or don't know where these beneficiaries are, there are companies out there that can help you out with that. Unclaimed property. Your decedent may have not cashed a lot of checks, so there could be thousands of dollars out there on that website. So something you want to check out. Next. Inheritance tax return, and I'm not going to go into this very much because Maureen is going to provide more details, but it is a responsibility of you as executor to ensure this is filed. You'll need to obtain appraisals on any type of real estate, tangible property, those guns, anything that you find in the house. You're going to cancel insurances that are no longer needed, and remember the homeowners is one you want to keep, but medical insurance, those type of things. Credit cards you need to cancel. You want to cancel magazines and newspapers. Again, you don't want anything piling up in front of the door to let people know that the house is vacant. And typically they don't forward junk mail, so that's still going to accumulate wherever the mail is put. Next. You need to give formal notification to the beneficiaries in writing, and this is a requirement in Pennsylvania. You're going to advertise the estate. In other words, you're going to put in 2 publications, the local newspaper and the law journal, that this person has passed away and who is handling the estate. This basically starts the time clock so that somebody can't come back to you a year after you closed everything out and look for payment. Next. So again, there are other items that you need to do, but I wanted to provide a little bit of what is required and you want to think about. Certainly securing the house and keeping the valuables safe is something you want to take care of right away. Next. So our beneficiaries, they may have been patiently waiting for what their share is going to be, or they may not have been so patiently waiting. So I suggest that you just kind of give them a time frame of when they can expect to receive money or items. It is not unusual for an estate to take at least a year to settle, and that's if it's simple. So I'm going to turn it over now to Maureen Gorman, who is an attorney with Stevens & Lee, and she specializes in estate planning. Next.
Thank you, Kim. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I see some thumbs up. So my name is Maureen Gorman. I am an attorney at Stevens & Lee. I've been practicing law for about 5 years now, and specifically estate planning and estate administration for about 3.5 years. My experience comes from advising people like Kim who are in a position where they have been appointed executor or administrator of an estate, and they're now responsible for doing all of those things that Kim was discussing in terms of marshaling the assets, paying off all of the debts and liabilities, and making distributions. And a bit of a disclaimer, I am only licensed to practice in Pennsylvania, so I am only really familiar with Pennsylvania law. I know there could be others watching here today or in the future who live in other states. And every state has different laws, although most states have somewhat similar laws in terms of death taxes and intestacy, which are a couple of the things that I'm going to talk about. But of course, if you're in a position where you have been appointed as executor, or you're looking to get your own estate planning documents done, it will be important to consult with an attorney in your state of residence. And also the information that I'm going to be providing is a very general overview. It does not cover everything that you would need to know. And so it is important that if you are, if you have specific questions about, your own estate planning documents or the estate planning documents of a loved one whose estate you're administering, that you seek counsel in that situation. And of course, you don't need to necessarily, but it is a very helpful resource. And so Samantha, if you could move to the next slide, I think that's where I began. Yeah, so my portion of the presentation is going to focus mostly on the assets of the person that has died and also the tax liability that comes along with death. And so, one of the questions that, people often ask is, what happens to all of my assets at my death, particularly if I don't have a will? And since the theme of our presentation is what to expect when death is unexpected, or what I wish I knew, that we're kind of running with this hypothetical scenario of a person who has died suddenly and maybe didn't have an opportunity to plan. Now, one important thing to note, though, is that not all assets are subject to a will. Those that are subject to the will are part of the probate estate or probate assets, and all other assets are non-probate assets. Now, that's not particularly helpful description. So I think it's important to define, what is a probate asset by looking at what is not a probate asset. And these are assets that, regardless of whether you have a will or not, they would pass completely outside of the will. So assets that are considered non-probate assets include property that is owned jointly with another person with a right of survivorship. And that last part is important because there are types of joint ownership that don't have a survivorship element to them. But if it does have a right of survivorship, then it passes automatically by operation of law to the other joint owners at one of the owners' death. Other assets that are non-probate include assets that have beneficiary designations associated with them, such as most retirement accounts and life insurance. Now, one caveat to those being considered non-probate is that in some situations where there is no beneficiary designated on those assets, the terms of the plan will say that it passes to the estate. So for those assets, it's important that you make sure that you have a beneficiary designation. And if you want it to be your estate, that's fine. Just know that your loved ones will need to open an estate in order to access those assets. Otherwise, you can simply name the person or the people that you would like to be your beneficiaries, and the proceeds will can be claimed by those individuals without having to go through probate. Transfer on death and pay on death bank accounts similarly have a beneficiary designation associated with them. And assets that are owned by an inter vivos trust. I believe someone asked a question about that earlier in the presentation. So any assets that are owned by a trust that you create during your lifetime, and usually those trusts are revocable, but they can be irrevocable as well. Those are not considered your assets outright individually anymore once they are transferred to the trust. And the only assets that become part of your probate estate are assets that you own outright in your own name without any beneficiary designation. So once you transfer something to a trust, it no longer is part of your probate estate. And theoretically, if you transferred all of your assets to a trust, you can avoid the probate process. Next slide. So for all of those assets that were not on that list of non-probate assets, we now are in a situation where they will either pass by will, or if there is no will, a question that people often have is, well, what happens to them? So every state has a set of default laws that govern what happens to your property when you die. And if you never make a will during your lifetime, then those are the rules that will apply at your death in your state of residence at that time. And a will is simply a way that you modify what those default rules are. And there are some situations where, you know, a poorly drafted will may not actually dispose of all of your assets. So you could have a partial intestacy, but a will that's properly drafted and is valid should dispose of all of your assets, so that you you are in control of what happens to those assets at your death, as opposed to the default rules under state law. So in Pennsylvania, which is the state that we're focusing on for today's purposes, because that's what I'm familiar with, the Pennsylvania law provides that, first and foremost, we have to look at whether the decedent had a surviving spouse and figure out what that spouse's share is. And then any additional amount that doesn't go to the surviving spouse would pass to the decedent's children and grandchildren or grandchildren, their descendants. If they don't have any descendants, then it would, and if they have parents that survived them, it would go to the parents. Then it would go down to the siblings. And if there are, no individuals in any of those categories, it goes back up to, grandparents, and then back down to aunts and uncles, and then cousins. And ultimately, if there is no one else living, then it would revert to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But that's a very rare situation. There's usually someone that falls into one of those categories before we get down there. So the surviving spouse share, going back up to that for a moment, the share that the surviving spouse gets depends on what other individuals may or may not be living so at that time as well. So if there are no descendants or parents, then the surviving spouse will get the entire estate. If there are no descendants, but there are one or more parents, then the surviving spouse will get the first $30,000 plus half of whatever is left. And then it actually is the same if there are no descendants, if there are descendants and all of them are also the surviving spouse's descendants, then the surviving spouse's share is the same, the first $30,000 plus half of the balance. And then if there are descendants and one or more of them are not the surviving spouse's descendants, then the surviving spouse will only get half of the estate. Next slide. So aside from the beneficiaries, the next question is, who is going to be in charge of actually administering the estate? So Kim talked earlier about all of those duties. And if you have a will, you have the option to name the person that you would like to administer your estate. That person is called the executor or the executrix. Now, of course, as Kim mentioned, that person doesn't have to do it if they don't want to, or if they're not able to. And sometimes they die before the decedent, so they're obviously not able to. That's why if you have a will, you should always have a successor named as well. But sometimes, neither of those individuals are able to serve. If you die without a will, as is the case in our hypothetical scenario here, then obviously you haven't named the person that you would like to administer the estate. And if an estate is opened, an administrator will have to be appointed by the Register of Wills. Now, I say administrator because it's a different term than executor, but it's the same thing. Legally, the same responsibilities essentially as the executor would have had. So the Register of Wills will have to appoint someone, and generally the order of priority when you have an intestacy is that the surviving spouse would come first, then intestate heirs, and that's sort of based on the share that they're entitled to. Those would get ones that are entitled to a larger share would come before others, and ultimately it's the Register of Wills discretion to appoint someone. If none of the heirs or the surviving spouse petition to open an estate, there is the ability for creditors to open an estate, because if you think about it, creditors are needing to be paid out of the decedent's assets, and the only way to do that is if an estate is opened. And if none of the beneficiaries are willing to do it, then the creditors may do it so that they can, if there's a large enough sum that's due to them, it may be worthwhile for them to open an estate. And lastly, other fit persons. Again, the Register of Wills has a lot of discretion in appointing an administrator. And it can be, particularly, it can be, contentious depending on the family dynamics, which is why it's always important to have a will, especially if you have someone in particular in mind that you trust in order to, to have these responsibilities, that you have a document in place naming that person. Next slide. So I did want to talk about Pennsylvania inheritance tax. Not all states have death tax. Some states don't have any inheritance or estate tax. Pennsylvania, though, does have inheritance tax, and it applies to Pennsylvania residents and non-residents who own real estate or other property that is physically located in Pennsylvania. The tax is due at death, but it becomes delinquent 9 months after death, which is a weird way of saying that the return is really due 9 months after death. You can get a 6 month extension, but even if you apply for an extension, the tax is still due at that time, so you have to make an estimated payment by then. As Kim mentioned earlier, there is a discount, a 5% discount for payments made within 3 months of date of death. The tax rate for inheritance tax depends on the relationship of the beneficiaries. So the surviving spouse, the rate for the surviving spouse or a parent of a deceased child under the age of 21 is 0%. Direct descendants and lineal heirs is 4.5%. Siblings are 12.5%, and all others are 15%. And transfers to charities and other government entities are not subject to inheritance tax. Next slide. So transfer tax essentially applies to all transfers by will or intestacy. Essentially, it's easiest to think of it as just any assets that you own at your death. And it includes gifts that are made within a year of death to the extent that they exceed $3,000. You get that little exemption there. It includes property in which the decedent had retained interest as well. Certain assets that are not subject to inheritance tax are life insurance, retirement assets, if the decedent did not have a present possessory interest, which in today's terms really just means that they are under the age of 59 and a half, so they wouldn't be able to take withdrawals without incurring a penalty. Property owned jointly between spouses, and real or tangible property located outside of Pennsylvania. And as Kim mentioned earlier, the value that is relevant for tax purposes is the value of the assets on the decedent's date of death. And I think I have just one more slide because I know we're out of time. I wasn't going to spend a lot of time discussing federal estate tax in any case, because it affects very few people. The ones that it affects are in most cases well aware of it, because it is a very high rate of tax, 40% rate. And the reason it applies to very few people is because the exemption is so high. Currently, it is almost $13 million per individual, and over 25 million for a married couple. And it's going to increase in the future up until 2026, when it will go back down. But even then, it's still going to be around $5 or $6 million. So unless you have unless your asset is close to that size, you probably will not have to worry about federal estate tax. And I believe we're out of time. And someone asked about how is inheritance tax dealt with if the trust owns the real estate. The same way, just because it's in a trust, it does not change the inheritance tax liability, but the trustee would have to file the return. And I hope that I answered everybody's questions.
There's one, and it could be Kim,
Okay.
who would answer this. Is the executor legally responsible to pay outstanding credit cards and hospital bills, things
Yes.
such as that?
Yes, they would. And that would also be a deduction for inheritance tax, which is one of the things that I would also mention, is that those expenses, funeral expenses that Samantha talked about earlier, as well as debts like those credit card bills, those are deductible for inheritance tax purposes, and they do need to be paid.
With my
Piggybacking off of Maureen's answer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Depending on a funeral home's policies, a funeral home may not be willing to accept payment by the estate because there's no way of knowing how long it will take an estate to be administered. Some funeral homes are going to ask for payment up front or require payment prior to the date of service. Other funeral homes will accept payment by an estate if a lawyer is involved and the firm knows that attorney and there's a working relationship there. So yes, a funeral can be paid by an estate, asterisk.
Right, just depends. So with my, I had an uncle who had passed away and he had a credit card through his bank. They actually just said that is no longer valid. You don't have to worry about that. So I guess, I don't know what I don't know about that, but I thought that was interesting. So have you seen?
Was there an estate to pay that, or was there no estate? Was there no other?
No, not really. There really wasn't. But I certainly think they could have kept it there to try. I don't know though. I have no idea. But anyway, just was something interesting. There's always a little something different with everyone. But thank you so much. This was a fabulous presentation, jam-packed with a lot of good information, lots of things people don't think about. It's exhausting to think about sometimes, but if you just chip away at it or start with pre-planning funerals or exploring trusts, or talking to your financial person at your bank, it doesn't have to cost you a ton of money to do all of that and explore those things, so that your loved ones are prepared a little bit for when you do pass. So thank you so much, Maureen, Samantha, and Kim. So much expertise within you all. If there are any follow-up questions, certainly you could post them to our website. It'll come to us and I'll forward them to the appropriate person, or you certainly could make an appointment with Kuhn Funeral Home and Samantha or one of her colleagues, and at Stevens and Lee with Maureen, or with Miss Ressler at Univest Bank. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending and your attention.